Welcome developers. Today I'm going to take you through a short tutorial in Unreal which focuses on modifying the side scroller template, specifically looking at getting a shared screen and shared keyboard layout for controlling not one but two players. I've already got this set up for you guys to look at, and as you can see, if I move left or right using the directional arrows, it controls player 1, and if I move left or right using the WASD keys, it can control player 2. So overall, if you find this video useful, I would encourage you to hit the like button, and if you want to see more videos like this in the future, definitely consider subscribing. So let's get into the development. So the first thing that we want to do here is I'm just going to jump out of my full screen mode. I'm going to jump into File as well, come down to New Project, go to Games, Next, and select the 3D side scroller template, and then go Next. Obviously give it a name that you want. I'm just going to call mine Shared Keyboard, and leave the defaults, and go Create Project. So once the project loads, the first thing that we actually want to do is manipulate some of the input settings. So I'm just going to come up into the Settings option here, and come down to our project settings, and then under Engine here down into Input we'll have the action mappings and the axis mappings, and we've got the jump and the move right. So the jump's good, and what we want to do is we actually just want to get rid of all these alternative keystrokes that are mapped to the jump, and I'm just going to remove W, spacebar, and the gamepad because we'll only be utilizing the keyboard, and this is for player 1. So what I'm going to do is actually rename this to player 1 underscore jump. Then we can add a second action mapping. I'm going to rename this to player 2 underscore jump, and I'm just going to use the abbreviations throughout this whole tutorial just to speed up the process. And we want to map W to this as our jump, and we've got the actions mapping sorted. We're going to do a very similar thing for the move right, but I'm just going to call this player 1 move. And essentially I want to get rid of the A and the D and the gamepad as well, and I just want left and then the right with a scale of -1 and 1. We can add another axis mapping. We can rename this to player 2 underscore move. And again, we want to just map this to the left or the A button. So we'll have to scroll down to find that on the keyboard. And we want to just add another mapping to this. And so I'm going to call this one D. Scroll down and find D in the keyboard. And A as -1. So the next thing that we want to do is set up a blueprint interface. So I'm just going to close down the input settings here, and you might be in the subroot of the project here in content. So we just want to jump into side scroller BP and jump into blueprints. In here we can right click and come up to blueprints and blueprint interface. Not blueprint class, which you'll commonly do, but blueprint interface. So a blueprint interface is a little bit different from normal blueprints, where it actually stores one or more functions with really no implementation. And these functions can be added to other blueprints. So it's very essentially the same as the concept of interface in general programming, which allows multiple different types of objects to all share and be accessed by a common interface. What I'm going to do here as well is just make sure I rename this to controls interface or controls transfer, up to you guys. And I'm going to double click on this to open it up. In here we really only need to add two functions, and it automatically creates a function for us. So in this one I'm going to actually call this send underscore player 2 underscore movement or move. And then I'm just going to come down here, I'm going to add an input, a new parameter for that input, and I'm going to make it a float. I'm also going to rename this new parameter or this float to axis underscore value. So that's one And then the other one we want to do, that's going to send the movement once we use the WASDs to player 2. We also want to send a new function, so you can right click and go add new, or you can come up to the plus button here, and we're going to send underscore player 2 underscore jump. And that's it. So we're just going to save and compile this and close it down. Moving on from here, we have to fix the player 1 controller because we've actually broken all its controls, and we also have to set up the camera so it's no longer attached to player 1. And to do that, we actually can come into the player 1 side scroller, but the first thing I'm actually going to do is rename this to player 1 side scroller, just by putting a P1 at the front. I can double click on this blueprint now and open that up. And there's a few things that we have to do in here. The first thing is we change the input axis and the input action. And essentially what that means is we no longer need this input axis because it is the wrong input axis. It's no longer move right, it's player 1 move. So we actually have to delete this, right click, and look for that player 1 move action or input axis, and we're just going to link this back into our add movement and link the axis back into the scale. Again, similar thing with the input action, we just have to delete these two. We're not actually using any input touch, and we can come in here and we can look for player 1, and we're just looking for the player 1 jump action event, and we're going to link the pressed into jump and the released into stop jumping. So essentially fix the control of our character. The next thing that we have to do is we actually have to just get rid of our camera that's linked to our player 1. So I'm just going to grab this spring arm and the camera itself, and if we zoom out we can see it here, and I'm just going to actually delete that. Cool. There's still a few other things that we have to do here. The next thing is we actually have to attach our blueprint interface. So if we come up into class settings, we can add our interfaces in here, and we're just going to look for controls transfer and add that in. And the next thing is just to play around with a few settings. So what we can do is just come to our character self and have a look at the settings in here as well. Yep, we just wanted to make sure use controller rotational yaws being disabled, which it has, and we want to make sure that auto possess player is set to player 0. And don't forget to save and compile. So the next step, we're going to close down that blueprint and we're going to create our new camera for the scene, and I'm just going to drag it anywhere into the project window here. And we've got to play around with some of the settings, so just come into the details of this camera and we want to change the translation to 2600, 200 and to 800. And then we want to change the rotation on the Z to 180, and that should frame up your scene quite nicely. You can obviously move the X to 2700 to make it a little bit better, and you can see here in the camera actor that we've framed up the level quite well. Now we have to link this camera actor to essentially the begin of the play. So I'm just going to come into the blueprints, come down into our open level blueprint, and I'm going to search for set view target as with blend. And I'm just going to turn on context sensitive, and I'm just going to drag that in. And then we need event begin play. And it's a good idea to turn the context sensitive back on as well. Link that into our execute. Then we also need to find the camera actor. You might have to scroll for this, but create a reference to the camera actor, and we're just going to link that into our new view, and we also are going to create one more, which is get player controller. Set that to an index of 0 and link that into our target here. Don't forget to save and compile. And now we should be able to press play, see our view, and move our character around utilizing the arrow keys. Perfect, so now we've got a shared screen. Alright, so the next step is we have to actually set up our player 2. This is probably the most complicated part of this tutorial, but first off we're going to come into our place actors here, and we're going to grab an empty character, and we're just going to drop that into our scene here. We can change its translation a little bit to match up with player 1, so we're going to make the X value 1199, the Y's arrow is 0, and the Z as 206. Cool. Next we want to change the rotation. I'm just going to change it 90 degrees on the Z axis, and that's just so it's facing the opposite direction there and not facing forward. Next thing that we want to do is I want to come into our static mesh here, and oops, sorry, I've selected the wrong thing. I'm going to come back to our empty player here and select the skeletal mesh, and we have the SK mannequin female here. That's always a good one to load in. Now don't worry about where she's located, we'll fix that up in a second. We also want to change our animation class to use blueprint and to third person BP or animate BP. Cool. Now we want to add a blueprint, so we're just going to come up to the blueprint here and add one, create one from scratch essentially, and load that up. And we've got our player here, and what we need to do is just move her into the correct space. So I'm just going to drop her down a little bit, I think to about -70. We could actually make it -90 or let's make it -85. And we'll also add in a rotation to this as well, just 90, so it's, or -90 to make sure it's facing the same way as the arrow. We also have to come into class settings, just like we did for player 1, and add in our controls transfer. And we'll be utilizing that a little bit later. Cool, now we have to play around with a lot of settings. So the first thing that we want to do is come into our blueprint self here. So we're going to scroll down to pawn. If I've got it here, yep, and just change use a rotational yaw. And we're going to turn that off. Then we're also going to come down into the character movement. And essentially we're going to change all these settings so it matches player 1. We can open up player 1 as well. And we can see all the settings that have been changed by this little yellow arrow. So that's really helpful, but I've made notes of which things that we need to change. So we're going to work through that one by one ourselves. The first thing that we want to do is just come down to our general here and change the gravity scale to 2. Then we want to jump down to our character movement walking and change our friction to 3. We want to come down to our character jumping and falling, and we want to change the jump velocity to 1000, air control to 0.8. Then we're going to come down to character rotation settings here. And we're just going to change the rotation rate to 720 instead of 360. And we're going to orient the player to the movement. We're also going to come down to nav movement nav mesh movement here, nav movement here, and we're just going to add in a nav agent radius of 42 and a nav angular height of 192. The last one is planar movement. We just want to set the constraint to plane as on, and we want to change the plane constraint normal to x1 and then y0 and z0. Cool. We want to save and compile this, and we can close all this down. We can also rename this new player controller to player 2 side scroller character. Cool. So essentially we've got the player 2 in here, but we have got no way to control it. So essentially this is the last little step to our project. So what we want to do is we do want to edit player 1 first. We want to set the controls that in here to be sent to player 2. And we can do that by just searching for our input axis. This time we want to find player 2, and we want to find our player 2 move input axis, and we want to send that to get all actors of class. I'm just going to zoom in here a bit. And we want to call the send player 2 function. So we can just search for player 2 again and call the send player 2 movement. And we want to link the axis value to the axis value, and we want to select the actor and just make sure that that's player 2 side scroller. And we want to link all actors out to target. And there we go. Essentially that's sending our movement over to player 2. So we can select anywhere on the event graph here and press C to create a comment, and we can call this send player or send P2 movement input. And set this up. Sorry being a bit pedantic here, but it's always good to keep a clean thing. And we can also rename this to player 2 input. And we can, player 1, silly me. And this one to player 1 jump input. We want to do a very similar thing for the jump here as well, so we're just going, I'll just add a comment in here and call it send player 2 jump input. And again, we just want to look for player 2 and find our jump action event. We want to get all actors again, so we could literally just copy this one here by selecting it, pressing Ctrl C and Ctrl V, and I'll link that in. And we want to find the player 2 call player 2 function jump, and we just want to link that into here and select the all actors and send that into there as well. Cool. Don't forget to save and compile, and we can close this down. Next thing we do, we want to open up the side scroller character here. I'm just going to get rid of all these little nodes here, start from scratch. And we want to just look for P2 again. This time we're going to set up an event for the move, and we're going to search for add movement, input, link that to execute, and link into the axis here, and set the world direction to -1. Similar for the jump, we want to search for P2, find the event send jump, and we want to search for jump, just add that in there and link that to jump. We can also add in our comments by clicking, press C, and we'll call receive P2 movement input. And again, add another comment here, receive P2 jump input. And we want to save and compile and close that down. Now if we press play, we should be able to move player 1 using the directional arrows and move player 2 utilizing the WOSD. So that's essentially it for the project here, but one little extra bit here, I will come up here and rename this side scroller template to, let's call it shared screen and keyboard. Cool. So I'm going to save this out, make sure everything's saved. I hope you really enjoyed the video. Don't forget to consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next development.